See, we lower this microphone to a spot where I can actually do this. And I get now this dual task of actually trying to see my slides, manipulate this, and still be seen by the audience. This is not that easy. Let's be real clear here. Oh, there's a clicker? I found the clicker. Okay, now I just need to be able to see the slides as well. So, no, first of all, really huge thanks to Angela and to the board for inviting us out. This is such a wonderful opportunity, and we are so very delighted that Alpha One is actually not only holding this meeting, but it's got all their the important other partners in terms of the patient communities that are here. As well as we recognize AlphaNet and some of the others from the U.S. So this is really kudos to you for putting all this together and having such a great turnout. So this is good. And when Angela asked me if I could do it, I basically said, "Oh my God, we've got another meeting that's running downtown at the same time. I don't know how you can get out here and do this, but anyway, we really feel that it is so very, very important. And I think, as she says, as a rare disease community, we have to work together as a rare disease community. So what I want to do is just talk to you a little bit about where are we in terms of orphan drugs regulations in Canada, where are we in terms of access to rare disease drugs in Canada, and maybe some of the challenges. I think I'm going to stand sideways so I can see the slides off of there better, and then I can also see people better, and hopefully you can see me at the same time. It's a bit of an interesting title around the life cycle approach, and I hopefully you either know some things about it or you'll appreciate very much why we're talking about this with regard to rare disease drugs. So let me ask this question. How many of you know about the orphan drug legislation, either in the US or what we've been doing in Canada? How many of you know about orphan drugs? Not very many people. Okay, so good. We can start at the basics here, okay? I was going to make you stand up and talk about it, but I guess I won't do that to you. Okay, so what are orphan drugs and rare diseases? Really, there are no such thing as orphan diseases. It's not the diseases that are orphans. It's the drugs that are orphans. So you're not orphans. Your diseases aren't orphans. The diseases are rare, but the drugs are orphaned. And really, we talk about orphan drugs because the history of rare disease is also the history of orphan drug discovery and pharmaceutical industry support. So it's intimately related. In many, many cases, rare diseases don't even get identified. They don't actually get recognized or actually get diagnosed and treated until there actually is a drug treatment. So this is very important to understand, is that as we identify these therapies, we actually create an awareness among the medical, the patient, and the public that these diseases are existing, and in fact, people begin to get diagnosed. I mean, you can imagine, right? Alpha-1, as with other diseases, can easily be misdiagnosed, can be underdiagnosed, can be delayed in terms of diagnosis because you're diagnosing sometimes in terms of symptoms, and you're not necessarily recognizing some of the underlying causes. So this is the history here. Most rare disease patient groups are started by patients and parents, and I think Alpha-1 is a huge example, as you all know. Some get started when an orphan drug is developed. Some of them, like Alpha-1, are started well in advance in terms of promoting the drugs. Some of them, we know, don't even get patients around them until there actually is some treatment. Availability of orphan drugs facilitates awareness, diagnosis, clinical expertise, access to treatment, guidelines for care. Again, once we actually have a therapy, in many cases, that's where the work begins in terms of who are the patients that are likely to be classified within this grouping? What are the possible ways in which we can actually diagnose them, and where are the kinds of symptoms that actually lead to that diagnosis? What are the proper ways in which we can treat these patients, whether it be through the drugs or whether it be through some other kinds of treatments? And again, Alpha-1 has a long history of actually developing some of the very best standards of care and guidelines, so that the guidelines are available not only to the specialists, but they're available way beyond in terms of other clinicians and other providers, but in many cases also to the patients and families. Almost every rare disease or orphan drug policy was a result of patient group advocacy, and you folks should know that, right? It's the patients that actually drive most of this. Without the patient groups, much of this doesn't happen. Without the parents, much of this doesn't happen. And I think we recognize the huge contribution that the patient community makes. Even as we're talking about more drugs coming in, it's the patient community that can actually stimulate that kind of development. working obviously in partnership with researchers and clinicians, and working very much in partnerships with the industry. But in many cases, and the US is a really good example of it, in Europe as well, where the rare disease patient populations have often taken the lead in terms of actually promoting the development of a drug, whether it's from fundraising, as you know, to actually fund the research, supporting the researchers to identify the genes that may be the cause of those diseases. Needed higher up, sorry. That's why you have good AV people. Thank you. Okay. And also in terms of being able to support the ongoing development of it, being available for clinical trials, being available to actually help promote in terms of the ongoing development of it, getting it approved, getting it reimbursed. So there's an intimate relationship between patient groups and orphan drug development and the industry, and that's just a little diagram here, just so that's the patient groups that oftentimes, start in terms of developing and helping promote the need for a drug, or even providing some of the initial funding to it, getting it actually approved to regulatory approval, making that drug available in terms of patient populations, helping support the ongoing guidelines and treatment access to it, and then making sure that there is a supportive program. Because obviously these drugs are not used in isolation. They have to be used within a constellation of other kinds of supports, including specialists, including other kinds of support programs. I put this up here, and this is my long way into the fact that, some of you may know, Canada is the only developed country that does not have an orphan drug policy, does not have an orphan drug legislation, does not have an orphan drug regulations. Many less developed countries actually have an orphan drug policy, but we're the only developed country that does not actually have explicit support for the research and development for drugs for small patient populations. And the reason why this is so important is kind of in this slide here. So some of you may know that before 1983, in that whole decade, there were only 10 new drugs for rare diseases. And why was that? For the most part, because these drugs were considered to be not profitable. And they're called orphan drugs in many cases because a company would be developing a drug, and as they begin to develop this drug, the recognition is that these drugs were not going to actually ever reach a large enough patient population that they would be profitable. And that's not to say, developers are mean people. They just are in it because they need to be able to develop drugs that are going to be widely available. And so these drugs were shelved. That's why they're called orphan drugs. They were orphaned. Nobody wanted to develop them any further. And this is sort of the story about, how many of you do know the story of how the Orphan Drug Act got into the US? Okay, as I said, in the decade prior to 1983, there were only 10 new drugs. Since the Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1983, there have been 500 new therapies approved for rare diseases, actually benefiting some 35 million patients, if you think about it. I mean, that's pretty astonishing in the record. And as I said, the reason in many cases why it wasn't was because companies were not motivated to actually bring these drugs from that early development stage all the way through to market because it's so expensive. And what they saw was that they weren't going to get reimbursed. This is Abby Myers. Abby Myers was the first president of the National Organization for Rare Diseases in the USA. We often say CORD is sort of a little sister of NORD. So NORD was the beginning. 1980, actually it was 1981, Abby had a child who had Tourette syndrome. And her child was in a clinical trial for a drug. The drug was actually being developed by J&J for another bigger disease. It was not being developed for Tourette's. But as a side clinical trial, they actually put some patients with Tourette's on because it was similar to somewhat to the larger disease, et cetera, et cetera. As this drug was being developed, what they recognized was that it was not going to work for this bigger patient population. So they basically wrote a letter to everybody to say, we're going to discontinue the development of this drug, including patients who were on it with Tourette's, to say, we're stopping the trials. And Abby says, what do you mean you're stopping the trials? They're working. The drugs are working for my child. How can you stop the drugs? She says, well, we're never going to be able to make a profit out of the drug, so I'm sorry that you feel it may be useful for your community, but we have no reason for wanting to develop it further. And so, I mean, and again, there's been always that recognition that these were very challenging drugs to develop and that it was going to be very difficult to bring them to market. So Abby, you know, along with a bunch of other people, have been pressing for the U.S. to actually have some kind of an orphan drug act that would provide incentives for companies to actually develop these drugs. Incentives in the form of research grants, incentives in the form of expedited access to regulatory approval, and some other things that would make it so that it would, in fact, be an incentive for them to develop it for a small patient population. I could tell you the long version of the story, the short version. The long version is actually kind of fun. And so let me just, so what Abby did was Abby put a notice out in her newspaper, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. A mom who was in California read it and said, my gosh, my son's in that same position. He's also got Tourette and he's on the same drug. What can we do? So she talked to Abby, and Abby says, you call Henry Waxman. Henry's your congressman. Henry's one of the leaders that's pushing this Orphan Drug Act in Congress. Call Henry. So she gets on there and gets a hold of Henry. Henry says, yes, I've been looking for this opportunity. We recognize the challenges in terms of developing these drugs. We would like to be able to promote it. So what Henry did was to actually invite her story to be, you know, kind of publicized and told. In the context of it, hopefully it's not a totally younger audience. I show this sometimes, and I say, that's Jack Klugman. People look at me like, who's Jack Klugman? Hopefully you guys know who Jack Klugman is. Jack Klugman is actually a great actor. Yes, he's a little aged, but anyway, that's Jack Klugman. Actually, Jack Klugman's brother heard this story, right, and said, oh my gosh, my brother is doing a TV show, and he was doing some reality kind of TV shows early days. He says, we should have this story on there. So he gets on there and gets Jack to actually promote the story. And so then they go and and they said, okay, Henry says, let's have hearings in Congress. So they invite the patients and the industry to come in for hearings. Nobody showed up. Industry basically said, we don't care. It's too expensive. We don't want to develop these drugs. We're not going to be able to make any profit out of them. So nobody showed up. Henry said, can we do anything about this? So he says to Abby, can we get a patient demonstration? Can we get patients to come together from the rare disease community and we can do like this march in Washington? And Abby says, are you nuts? This is February. It's freezing cold down there. There's snow and ice everywhere. Most of my patients are, you know, not that mobile. They're in wheelchairs. They're everywhere else. How am I going to get a whole bunch of patients to Washington to do a march in Washington? Henry says, don't worry about it. They got Jack on there. Jack says, we can make this happen. There's a boulevard in Los Angeles, looks just like Washington. He says, we'll just bring the patients out there. They flew all the patients down to Washington. They filmed this, you know, March on Washington. They used it in Congress there. So if you ever see this as testimony, you'll see, no, that is not ever, was not in Washington. They used it to actually get Congress woken up. And they said, okay. They invited in the companies now. 30-some companies showed up. That's how the Orphan Drug Act at least got its beginning. So 2 years later, they passed this act that really provided the support and incentives for the research and development of orphan drugs. And that was the beginning. In 1999, 2000, the European Union says, okay, we need to have that happen as well. So they got on there. Japan put together an orphan drug regulations. The EU was a big one that brought together 27 countries and said, we want to do it. Australia, as you can see in there. And in fact, many other countries, including Korea, including even Brazil, Mexico, etc., have all put together orphan drug regulations, except Canada. We've been pressuring Canada. In 1996, Canada says, we don't need an Orphan Drug Act in Canada. They got one in the US, they're developing drugs. We can actually make that, we'll just buy the drugs as they're being developed. We don't want to do anything special for it, which is an interesting scenario. And I came into court in about 2005, maybe. Some of you will know that I've got 2 children, both of whom were born with rare diseases. I've been involved in terms of advocacy, especially in the late 80s, early 90s with the hemophilia community, with all the issues around the tainted bloods, how I actually began to know some of the patients involved with the plasma products, et cetera. So we did a lot of advocacy, you know, on that behalf. And so at one point somebody said, could you write could you write a white paper for us on why we need an orphan drug policy in Canada? So that's how I got involved actually directly with CORD. And I spent about 6 or 7 years as a volunteer for CORD, helping to promote the need for an orphan drug policy. One of the things we did in order to get Parliament to pay attention, the ministry, we came back and said, what's happening in Canada is that our patients are not getting access to these drugs. Beyond that, they're not getting into clinical trials because countries don't come to Canada And I know that. I can remember sitting on a plane flying back from Poland, and I'm sitting next to a person. We started to chat, and it turns out she's developing a drug or her company has developed a drug for one of the rare disease patient communities. And I said, oh, good, are you going to come to Canada? She said, oh, no, we don't want to bother with Canada. You guys are going to have an orphan drug policy. It's really difficult to get reimbursement there. The patient population's really small. We don't want to bother coming to Canada. I said, well, are you kidding me? You got to come to Canada. We have patients there, and I know this community. They're reinforcing the community in terms of what they're doing. You got to come to Canada. In fact, I remember going back down to Washington and meet her again to say, come to Canada. We can help you. So all of this was, sheesh. You could just stay here and hold it up. Save you a lot of walking back and forth, you know. Could somebody give this guy another piece of cheesecake? Really, I mean, this is the challenge we've got, right? So we sit here with one of the best healthcare systems in the world, but we actually made the case. I remember meeting with the deputy minister and saying, look, here's our challenge. He says, but we get the drugs. I said, no, we don't. We get about half of the drugs. And I know that because we knew so many patient groups that were not getting access to the drugs. And in fact, I said, I'll prove it to you. We actually did a hand count at the time. We went through and we looked at the list of all the drugs that were designated orphans approved in the US, all the drugs that were designated orphans approved in the EU, and we matched it up against the Health Canada website in terms of what was available. This was before they actually had a really good listing so you could get access to information. We really worked hard to get it. And we came back and I said, here's my list. About 48% of the drugs approved in the US, 52% of those that are approved in Europe are actually available here in Canada. He looked at me, he goes, that's impossible. I said, well, here, take the list. They took it away, and they came back and said, okay, you miscounted a little bit, we're missing some, it's about 60%. But they said it's not good enough. And that's how we began to get movement on this orphan drug regulatory framework in Canada. It was a commitment to say, okay, it's not good enough that our patients are not getting access. And they basically said, we didn't know this was happening. What we also knew was not happening is that the research and development wasn't happening in Canada. And some of you may know some of the drugs. Actually, research discovered in Canada, the minute they get into a place where they're going to go into actual clinical trials development, the companies pick up and move to the US because the incentives are in the US. They pick up and they move to Europe because the incentives are not here in Canada. We actually do not do much support. I mean, and I think that's our challenge. We do a great job of actually providing really good health care. I don't think we would deny that we have good health care in Canada. What happens, though, is if you don't have somewhat of a common condition, you just don't get that special attention that's needed. So this is kind of what happens, right? We get the promise of innovative therapies. I said, for most of us, we look at new therapies coming in, we think like, oh boy, right? Here's what actually happens. We end up with this black box that basically says, how does the drug actually make its way there? And the reason it is because this is actually how drugs get approved in Canada. This is our drug approval process. Did you know that? The challenge is that every single one of those nodes has barriers to it, and they have time around them. So, I mean, the easiest part sometimes is getting the drug to Health Canada. I mean, mind you, sometimes we do. I even had one of the Health Canada Director Generals told me, he said, we actually chase companies to get them to come up to Canada. I said, isn't that a tragedy? Wouldn't they know to come to Canada? But anyway, it has to come into Canada first, right? It has to be, maybe there's this, I'm afraid to press anything. Oh, here we go. So it comes into Canada. It takes, sometimes up to maybe about 2 years to get it approved, though it can be an expedited approval, which will take about 120 days off of it. So in the US, if you are designated an orphan drug, you automatically get expedited approval because they recognize it's an unmet need. It's for oftentimes a patient population that doesn't have a drug. You remember I said, we have 500 new therapies for rare disease. You should know that only 5% of the rare disease populations actually has a drug treatment. 95% still don't have treatment. So this is 7,000 rare disease drugs. We have about treatment for about 500 of them. So this is the tragedy of it. So it is important to continue to develop them. So it gets to Canada. What happens then is, of course, it gets into the regulatory approval. Health Canada does not do a bad job of regulatory approval, but oftentimes people don't even know to come to Canada because we don't have any orphan drug program. Once it gets in there, it then has to go through what we call the health technology assessment. So Health Canada says, okay, we're going to review the drug. We recognize there's an unmet need. We recognize the benefits of the drug outweigh the risk. We're going to grant you then what they call a notice of compliance. You can now market the drug in Canada. Once that happens, which can take, up to about 8 or 9 months or longer, depending on the back and forth, it then has to go to a body called the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. Their job is not to say whether or not the drug works or not. Their job is to say how much does it cost, and do the benefits that are produced by that drug, is it worth the amount of money that's being asked? So they assess it against what else is available, how much better is it than what's available, how much does it cost, how much does it cost relative to the added value. And I won't go into the details of how that's done, but it actually is a very economic approach to it. It also looks a bit at where is its place in therapy. What are the current therapies? How much better is it than the current therapy? For whom would it be available? And what are the advantages in terms of having this? The real challenge in many cases for this assessment is that, one, rare disease drugs tend to be expensive. Small patient population, even with incentives, they still tend to be very expensive. So compared to a more common older drug, the cost per patient is actually quite high. No denying it. The cost to treat a patient with a rare disease is actually higher no matter what. Costs more to get diagnosis, costs more in terms of specialty and the supportive care, costs more in terms of the drugs. That's just the way it is because these are rare diseases, small patient populations. It does cost more. The challenge in many cases for some of these drugs coming in is that they may be the first drug to be approved, and oftentimes the cost effectiveness really looks at how does it work better compared to the old drugs. And when there isn't an old drug, it really is challenging to actually make that comparison. The other comparison that is done is that it compares to what else and who else can I treat for that same amount of money. So if your therapy costs $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year, the question is, how much added benefit do you get from it? Who else? What other patients? How many other patients with other diseases could I treat for that same amount of money, and how much benefit would it give to them? It is a comparison process. So, and there is sort of an index that they use in terms of how much it would cost to provide you with benefit for us to agree as a drug plan that we will make it available. The number used to be a bit more rigid. I think they've had a lot more flexibility in the number, but there is a number out there. And people say, how much is a life worth? And I said, I can tell you from the point of view of the drug agency how much your life is worth, because they have a number. And if it costs more than that, then it's really challenging to get the therapy through. So this is the case, right? And the system is in such a way that it really works hard for an orphan drug manufacturer, hard for rare disease. Anyway, it goes through this process. You get some assessment for them to say, okay, we think it may have a place in therapy. We believe that it, may or may not be appropriately priced. And once they make that assessment, then it goes to this group that basically says, okay, now, if it's a no, it stops. And about 50% of the drugs get a no. So these are drugs that are coming through the line, approved by Health Canada to say, yes, there's an unmet need. It goes through this cost effectiveness process. 50% of the drugs are basically said by this agency that they're not cost effective. We do not believe that they actually should be reimbursed by the drug plan. So and rare disease drugs tend to be more likely to get a no based on all the things I've said. So this is a challenge. So you got to get beyond that. But if you get beyond that hurdle, it now goes to this agency, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, used to be called the Pan-Canadian Purchasing Alliance, and their job basically is to negotiate a price. So now they get the manufacturers in, and they basically said, okay, you want to charge this. We've already had an agency way back here that says we think that's the right price. But what they're going to now say to you is that we think that price is too high. We're going to negotiate with you in terms of what the price is. Those are closed doors negotiations. We have no idea what it is they're doing in there. We don't know what the price is that's being asked. We don't know what's being negotiated. We do know that it can take 2 to 4 years to negotiate that price. And this is oftentimes for a therapy for which there is an unmet need. There may not be any other therapy, or it may be significantly better than the other therapies that are already there. It's oftentimes, by its very definition of a rare disease, it's a debilitating disease, it's a progressive disease, it's a life-threatening disease. And I can guarantee you that we've had patients that we have lost while they're negotiating that price. So this is the challenge. So we get this agency. This agency then finally negotiates a price. You would think that then we're done. No, we ain't done. Now it goes to the drug plans, each one of the provincial drug plans, who originally had signed in to say, okay, we will let you negotiate one price for all of us, which is actually a big step forward from what it used to be. It used to be every province would negotiate its own price, and that would take forever. But anyway, so we now got, no, it goes to the drug plans now who say, okay, we're now going to decide to list it. You are not obliged to list it. Even though you are part of the negotiation to say what the price is, there's nothing that forces you to, and you may take a long time to actually do it. We have provinces that have negotiated the price, have agreed to it, and have what they now call a letter of intent. You know, a letter of intent is like agreement to buy, like when you're buying a house or something, you put your bid in, right? They may sit on that letter of intent for months, honest to God, for years. So this is the other challenge, and now we're advocating. So every single step of the way, we're talking about patients getting involved in advocacy, trying to influence that decision, trying to move it along. So we finally get through to this negotiation, and if we're lucky, we get the drug that's made available. Now, if you have private insurance, we're working on this side. Usually, the private insurers are much faster. Oftentimes, once a drug is here, it can go through a private drug scheme and it can be made available. More and more, the private drug plans are saying, not so fast. And some of them are very deliberately, for any drug that is considered to be expensive, what they're saying is, let's wait until this is done. And in fact, what they're also saying is, let's wait and see what the price is, because we'd like to have that price as well. So this is the challenge. This is why, in patient advocacy, it's so important. But it means that, you gotta have, when a drug's coming through, so much effort in terms of getting it available. And I think, as many of you will know, and Angela will well know, even when it gets to the provincial level, you will have different access. Some provinces will say, I'll take that price, but I want to make it available to these patients. Some provinces will say, we'll take that price, but we'll only make it available to patients who failed the older therapies. Some provinces will say, we'll take that price, but we're only going to make it to younger patients who have less severe disease where we can see a bigger benefit. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. If you think that, this is unbelievable, it is unbelievable. But this is the system that we're working with. And as I said, this is starting at this point where only half of the drugs, or less than half of the drugs, are even coming to Canada. For our ultra-orphan diseases, it's an even bigger struggle. So this is kind of what we do in terms of trying to say we need a better system. Now, we do have, we were supposed to have an orphan drug regulatory framework that would have allowed us to have actually gotten more drugs in and clinical trials earlier on. In fact, we had agreement with the US and Europe that if we got our orphan drug regulatory framework in place, it was harmonized enough with Europe and the US that they said a company could make one application to the EU and the US, which they can do today, get orphan designation, and they said we'd include Canada in there. It means we could get into clinical trials at the same time as the EU, all those countries, and the US. Without it, we get bypassed, and we then wait until the drugs are actually approved elsewhere. We have been promised by the provinces for the last 3 years. 2006 was when they first came out and said, we're going to give you a drug, well, they call it the expensive drugs for rare diseases, pharmaceutical plan, a way in which we could fund the drugs for rare diseases. That came and that went, and the whole pharmaceutical strategy disappeared. We lost that. Then we had them come back and say, okay, 2014, Minister Hoskins stands up again and says, on behalf of all the provinces, we're going to bring you a drugs for rare diseases program. 2015, nothing happened. 2016, nothing happened. 2017, at their last meeting, we keep writing to them, we keep badgering them on it, nothing's happened. 3 years later, still nothing. Still what's happening is that all these drugs are getting stuck here. All of us are advocating drug by drug in terms of access. So this is our challenge. We're hopeful. I don't mean to put it bleakly. We actually have seen progress. We have seen drugs that used to be almost a 90% no for rare disease drugs. We've got it down to about 60% no's. And even with the no's, we're getting them on an individual basis. So it is happening. So this is one of the, I won't go into this. This is really talks about the difference between the HTA. This is what we talk about in terms of advocacy. As many of you have seen, this is the way in which, sadly, many of us get access to drugs. We do public access. We do public, advocacy. I mean, this was one of the first ones we had. I mean, it's sad. You take little kids and you put them on a picket line to actually try to influence the ministers in terms of access to drugs. This is, some of you will remember this little gal with cystic fibrosis who was able to bring, actually, the provincial drug plans to their knees to say, okay, we will give you, access to this drug. The sad part about this, it doesn't change the policy. Yes, I can do it on a drug-by-drug basis. Yes, this gal did something great in terms of this particular drug. The next drug that came out for cystic fibrosis, they said no to. And we've got patients out there now lobbying again. I mean, really? Is this really what we wanted to do? So this is the challenge, this is the access. This is, again, breast cancer patient and costly therapies. I mean, what we are saying is that patients are getting involved. We're getting involved in all the stages. We're getting involved in terms of helping to move it. I will say the very good news is that we are at the tables. We are helping, being able to negotiate. I talk about the early stages of advocacy. It's sort of like this barbarians at the gate. We're outside the gates. We're trying to get in. Those are the early days of HIV, breast cancer, certainly with the whole blood issue, with hemophilia. We're out there trying to get in. I say if you do it good enough and you're around long enough, they actually do invite you to the table. But that first stage of getting invited to the table, I call it like being beggars at the table. They kind of look at you begrudgingly, and they're kind of trying to figure out who you are and what you are and what you're doing there. I remember the first time I was at a meeting, there was about 60 other clinicians there, and every time I spoke, people just ignored you. And, the conversation would go on. I said, I'm not that easy to ignore, but the conversation just goes on. Until one of the docs said, you know what, I think Durhane had a point there. We ought to discuss it. So they came back and discussed it. Conversation goes on. I'm trying to intervene again. They ignored it again. Another doctor says, you know what, I think we ought to follow up. That actually does make, good sense. And I realized at that point, I said, no matter what you know, no matter who you represent, no matter how many initials you have after your name, once you get identified as a patient advocate, you lose 50 IQ points. Yeah, might as well. It's like really challenging. But we've moved, right? And we now are at the point where I think most of them recognize they need us, and they can benefit from us. I still call it a little bit like strange bedfellows. You got something, I want something. We are not necessarily on the same page, but hey, you know what? We're going to do some give and take here, right? And so they do learn to appreciate it. Now we're getting to a point where I think where patients, I call patients of the new black, where everybody says, okay, everything's patient-centered. We want to make sure we have patients at the table. I think what they're afraid of is this last box where we actually have, the inmates are running the asylum. And I kind of say that not without any kind of pejorativeness, but, as I always say, when you think about how most healthcare systems and most hospitals are being run, I don't think patients could do a worse job of it. And I can say to them all the time, if you can't figure out how to make the drug budgets work, give me the monies. I bet you I could do a better job than you're doing right now in terms of how to make those drug budgets actually meet the needs of the people. But I'll finish up. So patient engagement is really critical. I think a lot of times this is sort of my same schema, but it really shows that patients are now being intimately involved in every way. Just came back from the FDA where they had a huge meeting on patient advocate groups and how patient advocate groups can get involved in developing drugs and being part of designing clinical trials, and very supportive of it. Far cry from what we're doing here in Canada. Patients actually making sure that we've got legal requirements that actually recognize the value of the drugs and making them available, helping to define how they actually are used in real practice, making sure that we've got the right guidelines so that they're used appropriately. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can provide, is the assurance that the drugs will be used appropriately, and then as patient groups helping to support the ongoing best practice treatments and guidelines, et cetera. I'll go through it quickly. I feel like I'm overlapping into a lot of other time here. This is what we call the life cycle, though, and this is the new approach towards certainly drugs for rare diseases, where the patients are not only intimately involved in every point, but the patients actually do have a lead role in terms of driving it. As I say, from development to approvals, to the right kind of usage, and to making sure that the information, once it's in use, is actually collected. I mean, this goes back to the notion of patient registries. Why are they so important? They're so important because that's where the information about how the drugs are being used, how the medical care is being used, so that it can actually be synthesized to come back and say what's working, what's not. I mean, we all agree. We want to make sure that we're going to make the best use of our healthcare resources and our dollars. Nobody wants to be on therapy that doesn't work. But the only way we're going to know that is if patients agree to participate, to have their information available, to be able to analyze that information on an ongoing basis so we know. And we can take out the things that don't work, and we can make sure that we're focusing on and we're supporting the things that do work. So this is a whole new relationship, again, in terms of patients. Active, not only active, engaged in their clinical treatment, but providing the information and helping to make sure that information is available in order for the therapies, not just drugs, to be actually appropriately analyzed. So we're really very much involved in terms of the whole life cycle. I won't go into this much. All of this has led up to the whole notion of managed access programs, because the challenge with many orphan drugs is that because there are unmet needs, because the patient population isn't well known, because we don't necessarily know the long-term prognosis with the drug plans are actually reluctant to actually fund them. And so they basically say, we don't know how they work. We don't know what the long-term outcomes are. So the managed access scheme basically says, if there's an unmet need, if there's a drug that's likely to work, let's make it available to the patients, and then on a go-forward basis, we'll collect that information and bring it back into the program to see what works. So we're asking is, take the risk earlier on. You don't need to have 10 years of data before you actually say a drug is going to work or to make it available to people. You want to do is provide it early on. But it means patients have to be involved to say, who should get access? How should we manage that? What information should we be willing to continue to provide in order to make sure it works? And we're saying to drug companies as well, you need to share into this. If the drugs are coming in early and we're bringing them in earlier and earlier because there's unmet needs, then you need to take a role in what we call risk sharing. You may want to fund some of that early drug. You may want to actually support the patients early on. And then if it works, the drug plans can pick it up. It's a fair exchange for the fact that you can bring the drugs in earlier. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to negotiate on in terms of what we call a managed access scheme. The idea is that we will manage the introduction of it and we'll make it available on a go-forward basis, as opposed to what seems to be happening now, and that is wait till you've got all the data for a long period of time to say the drug works, and then we'll fund. Well, if everybody did that, then nobody would get access. In Canada, what we oftentimes do is we wait for the US or Europe to actually fund the drugs. They collect information, and 5 years later, we say, okay, here's the bulk of the information. Now Canada can make it available. Obviously, we do not want to be that. We do not want to be what I call the guinea pigs of the world. Here's what happens when you don't have treatment. We can compare it to the people who are getting treatment. I don't think this is what we signed up for. So what we're trying to do is introduce some of these schemes into Canada. We have examples of how those work. They are working right now. We need to continue to support those. Many of the rare and ultra-rare drugs are actually brought in under those bases. And I end up with just a slide to say in Europe, this is what the UK has been doing more and more, a scheme for allowing drugs to be brought in early, to be negotiated in terms of who gets access, and to provide it. The beauty of the UK program that we don't have in Canada is that in order to decide who, not only who should get treated, but what is considered to be an effective outcome. So if you think about a disease even like alpha-1, right? If you're looking at just clinical outcomes, if you're just looking at long-term survival as the only legitimate outcomes, there are a lot of patients that might not actually get access. But if you look at improvement in quality of life, if you're looking at improvement of being able to continue to do work or to be able to engage, then those are actually much more meaningful outcomes. So what happens in the UK is they actually bring patients and parents to the table and they negotiate with them. What do you think are the right outcomes that we should be measuring? Let's make sure that we put in place some outcome measures that are relevant to patients. Isn't that great common sense? So meeting the triple aim challenge of not affordability is financing. Part of what I'm saying is that it isn't a matter of whether or not we can afford these drugs. We can afford them. For goodness sakes, Drugs in Canada, the rare disease drugs, still only count for about 5 to 6% of the total drug spend. This is not anything that's going to break the bank. We know that we can afford, and in many cases they do save healthcare costs, lives down the road. The question is, how do we finance them? How do we put the money in up front to make sure that the funding is available up front as the drugs are coming in and not wait until after the fact? So this is some of the other approaches that we're working on as well. How do we create funding pockets that are available up front? That's it. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be happy to take any questions, absolutely. I'd also be happy to sign you up for any advocacy stuff that we're doing. We have a 2-day meeting coming up. Next March, we will be in Ottawa. We're going to actually do an advocacy day, in Ottawa, and we'll do a 1-day advocacy on Rare Disease Day here in Toronto. So anybody that's willing to come out and join us in advocacy efforts, we'd be thrilled to have you.
Hi, Durhane, how are you?
Yeah.
I saw the open letter that was written by CORD to the Ministry of Health regarding the framework and the removal of any mention on the website. I was just wondering if you could provide an update, if they responded any which way.
Yeah. As I said, we've been working on this regulatory framework. We thought it was a pretty good framework. It allowed us to harmonize, blah, blah, blah. 2014, it was fully ready to go. The last Conservative government didn't get it through in terms of the actual approval process. We were told to wait until the new government kind of got its feet wet and figured out what it was doing, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what we know is that the government, the health ministry at this point is fully sidetracked on opioids and marijuana, which is not to say they're trivial things, but whatever. But we continue to advocate for it. What they've said to us is that those drugs for rare diseases can actually be brought in under current existing processes, right? So we've got expedited, we've got, in terms of early reviews, we've got special considerations for small patient populations and looking at early stage clinical trials. We can make approvals, with even stage 2 trials. They said all of that could be done under the current. But the problem is that a lot of researchers and companies don't know that. So they don't come to Canada. And we're saying, and we don't provide the benefits that an orphan designation gets. Because basically the message is that orphan drugs, rare diseases, you're just like any other disease, right? So we don't need to treat you in any way different. I mean, we all know that cancer gets treated different. We all know that the reason why HIV succeeded is HIV was treated differently. And what we're saying is that rare diseases has to be treated differently because if we wait, it's not going to work for us. I don't know, it just disappeared. It was still under consultation. They had told us that they didn't think it was going to happen, but it's still been in the consultation stream. It was going to have consultation this year, and then all of a sudden it got pulled. The only way I got it pulled is that a reporter called me up and says, what do you think about this? And I'm like, oh my God, nobody even told us. Nobody even consulted with us, So we were pretty, my immediate response is it's the kiss of death. You might as well just kind of wipe out, rare diseases in Canada. It is, but we haven't given up. We're back at the table. We had a meeting with the minister last week, and we're going to try to continue to press forward on this, and that's one of the reasons why we want to have the Advocacy Day in Ottawa. We do know that a lot of the MPs are on side, and so this is the sad part. We know that there's willingness. I will say is that we heard one of the reasons why it's never gotten implemented is that the provinces were pushing back. We heard that the provinces were afraid that with some kind of orphan drug designation, it would encourage drugs to come in earlier. Geez, like that's a bad thing to treat people earlier. That there is a sense that having an orphan designation allows companies to charge whatever they want. So that's the reason why these drugs are so expensive. It has nothing to do with development costs and nothing to do with the realities of it. It's just because companies want to be able to charge as much as they can. So, and let's be clear, there may be some companies that have taken advantage. I mean, in my personal experience, that's few and far between. So I don't know what the right price for a drug is, but I do not know companies that are going out there deliberately saying, let's see how we can gouge the rare disease community by charging them and by keeping people from being able to get access. I think most people are working really hard to try to get access. So that's what happened, and that's why we're trying to, we will continue to push back on it, but it is, we recognize. I said somebody's like pushing a gigantic boulder up the hill. What we're really afraid of is that we're going to lose our grip and it's going to come back down on us. So that's why we need all you guys. Thank you.